I'm Lena Carter, 26 years old, and I'm still trying to figure out when exactly I stopped believing I deserved better. Maybe it was the day my brother Ethan threw my college acceptance letter in the trash, telling me journalism was for wannabe writers who can't handle real careers. Maybe it was earlier, when I was 12 and won the county essay contest, only to have my parents miss the award ceremony because Ethan had a baseball game the same night. Or maybe it started the day I was born, 3 years after the golden child who could do no wrong. But today, sitting in my cramped studio apartment in downtown Millbrook, staring at the stack of unpaid bills on my coffee table, I can pinpoint exactly when I realized nothing had changed. It was 2 weeks ago when I moved back to this mid-sized Pennsylvania city after 5 years away at college and struggling to make it as a freelance journalist in Philadelphia. 2 weeks ago when my mother called to invite me to Sunday dinner, and the first thing she said wasn't, "Welcome home," or "We missed you." It was, "Ethan just got promoted to senior analyst at Morrison Associates. Isn't that wonderful?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millbrook wasn't the worst childhood imaginable, but it wasn't exactly the loving family portrait my parents liked to display on our mantelpiece either. Our town had about 80,000 residents, big enough to have a small downtown and a couple of shopping centers, but small enough that the Carter family name carried weight. My father, Thomas Carter, owned Carter Construction, one of the largest building companies in the Tri-County area. We lived in Willowbrook Estates, the kind of neighborhood where the houses all had circular driveways and perfect lawns, and where my mother, Margaret, could host her bridge club without worrying about what the neighbors might think. From the outside, we were the picture of success. Inside our colonial home, with its cream-colored walls and formal dining room that we only used for special occasions, the reality was different. Everything revolved around Ethan, his needs, his schedules, his dreams, his future. I was an afterthought, the insurance policy in case something happened to the heir apparent. Ethan is 29 now, and he's everything my parents ever wanted in a son. Tall, confident, with my father's piercing blue eyes and my mother's aristocratic nose. He graduated from Penn State with a business degree, landed a job at Morrison Associates right out of college, and worked his way up to senior financial analyst in just 7 years. He drives a BMW, lives in a penthouse apartment downtown, and dates women who look like they stepped out of fashion magazines. When he walks into a room, people notice. When I walk into a room, people politely nod and then forget I was there. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When I brought home A's on my report card, my mother would smile and say, "That's nice, dear." When Ethan brought home B's, they'd take us all out to celebrate at Romano's, the nicest Italian restaurant in town. When I scored the winning goal for my high school soccer team, they clapped politely from the sidelines. When Ethan hit a double in his senior year baseball game, my father stood up and cheered so loudly the people 3 rows away turned to stare. But it was more than just preferential treatment. It was the way they excused everything Ethan did. When he was 16 and crashed my father's truck after drinking at a party, my parents grounded him for 2 weeks and bought him his own car the following month. When I was 17 and got home 15 minutes past curfew because I'd stopped to help Mrs. Henderson change her flat tire, I lost my car privileges for a month. When Ethan called me stupid during family dinners, my mother would sigh and say, "Ethan, be nice to your sister." But there were never real consequences. When I finally snapped back one Christmas Eve and told him to shut up, I was sent to my room and missed dessert. "Young ladies don't speak that way," my mother informed me later, especially not to their older brothers. I learned early to keep my mouth shut and my expectations low. Despite everything, I worked hard to be the daughter they wanted. I joined the Honor Society, volunteered at the animal shelter, and tried to be invisible whenever Ethan was having one of his moods. I thought if I was perfect enough, if I caused no problems and achieved enough success on my own, they might finally see me as valuable. I thought wrong. When I told them I wanted to study journalism at Temple University, my father laughed.
actually laughed like I'd told him I wanted to become a circus performer. Journalism doesn't pay the bills, Lena. What are you going to do, write for the local newspaper until you're 50? Be practical. My mother was gentler, but no less discouraging. Honey, journalism is such a competitive field, and with the internet and everything, newspapers are closing all the time. Why don't you consider something more stable? Maybe teaching or nursing? But for once in my life, I stood my ground. I'd saved money from my part-time job at the local bookstore, and I'd earned partial scholarships based on my grades and my portfolio of articles I'd written for the school paper. I was going to Temple, whether they supported me or not. They didn't support me, but they didn't actively sabotage me either. That was progress in the Carter household. College was the first time I felt like I could breathe. In Philadelphia, surrounded by people who didn't know about my family dynamics or my brother's achievements, I started to discover who I might be when I wasn't constantly being compared to Ethan. I made friends who thought I was funny and smart. I dated guys who actually listened when I talked. I wrote articles for the university newspaper that professors praised, and that sparked interesting conversations with my classmates.
For 4 glorious years, I existed in a world where my worth wasn't determined by how I measured up to the golden child. But college ends and real life begins. And real life, it turned out, was harder than I'd anticipated. Freelance journalism in a major city is exactly as difficult as everyone warned me it would be. For 2 years after graduation, I lived in a studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood in North Philadelphia, surviving on ramen noodles and determination. I wrote pieces for local magazines, contributed to online publications, and picked up whatever freelance work I could find. Some months I made enough to pay my bills. Other months I had to choose between groceries and heat. My parents' response to my struggles was predictable. "You could come home any time," my mother would say during our weekly phone calls. "There's always a place for you here." But what she really meant was, there's a place for you here if you admit defeat and accept that Ethan was right all along. Meanwhile, Ethan was thriving. Every conversation with my parents included updates about his latest promotion, his new apartment, his expensive vacations. "Ethan just got back from skiing in Aspen," my mother would gush. "The photos he posted on Facebook are just gorgeous. You should see them." I didn't look at Ethan's Facebook. I'd unfollowed him years ago to preserve what was left of my sanity. The breaking point came last spring when I got food poisoning from a questionable sushi restaurant and ended up in the emergency room. Alone, because the guy I'd been dating had decided he wasn't ready for a relationship, and my closest friend was out of town for work. I sat in that sterile waiting room at 2 a.m., shivering under a thin hospital blanket, and realized I was tired of being alone all the time. Tired of struggling. Tired of proving something that maybe didn't need to be proved. When my mother called the next week to tell me about an opening at Millbrook Regional Medical Center for an administrative coordinator position, I found myself actually listening. The salary was decent, the benefits were good, and it would allow me to move back home temporarily while I figured out my next steps. I could save money, pay off my student loans, and maybe even freelance on the side. "It's not journalism," she said, as if I didn't already know that, "but it's stable, and you'd be helping people, working in healthcare." What she didn't say, but what we both understood, was that it would also mean admitting that Ethan had been right, that my dreams were impractical, that I should have listened to them from the beginning. I took the job. Moving back to Millbrook felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit. Everything was familiar but wrong somehow, like looking at your childhood bedroom after you've grown up and realizing how small it actually was. My parents helped me move my few possessions into a studio apartment downtown, the best I could afford on my new salary. My father made a point of mentioning that it cost less than Ethan paid for his monthly car payment. The job itself wasn't terrible. I worked at the medical center's main office, coordinating patient files, scheduling appointments, and handling insurance paperwork. It was mind-numbing and repetitive, nothing like the investigative pieces I dreamed of writing. But my coworkers were kind and the work was steady. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get back on my feet. But temporary has a way of stretching when you're not sure what you're working toward anymore. The first family dinner after my return home was a preview of what was to come.
My parents spent the entire meal talking about Ethan's latest achievement. He had been chosen to lead a major account at Morrison Associates, some big client from New York who was impressed by his innovative approach to financial planning. I sat there, picking at my mother's pot roast, and tried to contribute something about my new job. "That's nice, dear," my mother said when I mentioned that I'd streamlined a filing system that had been backed up for months. Then she immediately turned back to Ethan. "Tell us more about this New York client. Are they really talking about opening a branch office here in Millbrook?" Ethan basked in their attention, gesturing with his wine glass as he described his brilliant strategies and the client's obvious admiration for his work. He was on his second glass of wine by the time we'd finished the main course, and his gestures were getting more expansive, his voice a little louder. "The thing is," he said, leaning back in his chair with the satisfied smile of someone who had never doubted his importance, "success in finance is all about confidence. You have to project authority. Clients can smell weakness, and if they sense you're not completely sure of yourself, they'll walk away." He glanced at me when he said this, just for a second, but long enough for me to understand that he wasn't just talking about his work. I should have said something then, should have called him out, or at least changed the subject. Instead, I excused myself to help my mother clear the dishes, swallowing the familiar taste of disappointment and resignation. Later, as I drove back to my apartment through the quiet streets of Millbrook, I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that maybe now that we were all adults, the family
Dynamics would eventually shift, that maybe Ethan would mature and my parents would finally see me as something more than their consolation prize. I was so naive. 3 months into my return to Millbrook, I'd settled into a routine that felt both comfortable and suffocating. Monday through Friday, I worked at the medical center, processing paperwork and answering phones. Evenings, I'd go home to my studio apartment, heat up a frozen dinner, and try to work on freelance articles that editors either rejected or paid so little for that they barely covered my grocery bills. Weekends, I did laundry, grocery shopping, and tried to avoid thinking too hard about whether this was what the rest of my life was going to look like. The one bright spot was reconnecting with Michael Brennan, someone I'd known in high school who had become a middle school teacher here in Millbrook. We'd bumped into each other at the coffee shop downtown, and he'd asked me to grab lunch the following week. Unlike most of my interactions these days, talking to Michael felt easy. He listened when I spoke, asked thoughtful questions about my work, and never once made me feel like I should apologize for not being more successful. "You know," he said during one of our weekly lunch meetings, "the way you describe organizing that patient filing system at work sounds like investigative skills to me. You identified a problem, researched the best solution, and implemented a system that made everyone's job easier. That's exactly what good journalists do." I stared at him across the table at Murphy's Deli, holding my turkey sandwich halfway to my mouth. It had been so long since someone had connected my current work to my dreams that I'd almost forgotten they were related. "I'm processing insurance forms, Michael. It's not exactly uncovering corruption in City Hall." "Maybe not," he said, smiling, "but you're seeing patterns, solving problems, making systems work better. Those are transferable skills. Just because you're not writing investigative pieces right now doesn't mean you never will again." It was the kind of encouragement I should have been getting from my family, but I'd learned not to expect that from the Carters. Family dinners had become a monthly obligation that I dreaded but couldn't avoid without facing a guilt trip from my mother that would last for weeks. The pattern was always the same. My mother would cook an elaborate meal, my father would open an expensive bottle of wine, and everyone would spend 2 hours discussing Ethan's latest triumphs while I sat there like a supporting character in someone else's story. But something had changed in Ethan over the past few months. His successes seemed to be coming faster, and his lifestyle was becoming more extravagant. He'd traded in his BMW for a Mercedes. He'd moved from his penthouse apartment to an even more expensive loft in the newly renovated warehouse district. He was taking trips to New York and Miami that seemed excessive, even for someone in his position. When I mentioned this to Michael, he raised an eyebrow. "Senior analysts make good money, but not new Mercedes and Miami every month money. Unless he's got a trust fund you don't know about." "No trust fund," I said. My parents are comfortable, but they're not Mercedes for your 29-year-old son comfortable. Maybe he's just really good at his job. Maybe. But something felt off. Ethan had always been confident, but lately he seemed almost manic in his enthusiasm for his work. He name-dropped clients constantly, bragged about deals he was working on, and made subtle references to having insider knowledge that gave him an edge over his competitors. The warning signs were there, but I was too caught up in my own struggles to pay much attention. Besides, questioning Ethan's success would have been seen as jealousy by my parents, and I'd already been cast as the bitter younger sibling who couldn't be happy for her brother's achievements. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday evening in November. I was working late at the medical center, trying to catch up on a backlog of patient files, when I overheard a conversation between two of the doctors in the hallway outside my office. "I just don't understand how Morrison Associates got access to our expansion plans," Dr. Rodriguez was saying to Dr. Kim. "We haven't made any public announcements about the new cardiology wing. The board meeting was supposed to be confidential." "Maybe someone on the board has connections there," Dr. Kim suggested. "Didn't they just win the contract to handle the financing for the project?" "They did, and their proposal was suspiciously detailed for a company that wasn't supposed to know about our specific plans." I froze at my desk, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Morrison Associates was Ethan's firm, and I knew about the cardiology wing expansion because I'd been the one processing the paperwork and scheduling the confidential board meetings for the past 2 months. It was probably nothing, probably just a coincidence. But as I sat there in my empty office, listening to the doctor's footsteps fade down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Something that was about to change everything. The conversation I'd overheard between Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Kim stayed with me for days. Every time I processed another piece of paperwork related to the medical center's expansion project, I found myself thinking about Morrison Associates and their mysteriously detailed proposal. Every time Ethan's name came up in family conversations, I wondered how he could afford his increasingly lavish lifestyle on a senior analyst's salary. I told myself I was being paranoid. Ethan was successful, and successful people made good money. Maybe he'd gotten a raise or a bonus, or had made some smart investments. Maybe Morrison Associates was just really good at what they did. Maybe I was looking for problems where none existed because I was jealous of his success and bitter about my own struggles. But the doubt had taken root, and doubt has a way of growing when you feed it with observation. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to things I'd previously dismissed. The way Ethan would check his phone obsessively during family dinners, smiling at messages he never shared. The way he'd casually mention running into business contacts at restaurants and events around town, always in contexts that seemed to involve confidential information. The way he'd make vague references to insider knowledge and being in the right place at the right time. I also started noticing things at work that I'd previously overlooked. The medical center's board meetings weren't just about the cardiology wing expansion. Over the past 6 months, they'd discussed plans for a new pediatric unit, negotiations with insurance companies, and potential mergers with smaller practices in the county. All information that could be valuable to a financial firm looking to predict healthcare industry trends or position themselves for lucrative contracts. All information that I had access to as part of my job. The realization hit me on a Thursday afternoon in December when I was updating patient records. I had access to confidential medical center information. Ethan had access to me, and Morrison Associates seemed to have access to information they shouldn't have. I sat at my desk, staring at the computer screen, feeling sick to my stomach. It was speculation, not proof. But it was speculation that made too much sense to ignore. The ethical thing to do would have been to report my suspicions to someone in authority at the medical center. But report what, exactly? That my brother worked for a financial firm that had won a contract my employer was offering? That he seemed to be making more money than I thought he should? That I had a feeling something wasn't right? I had no proof, no evidence, nothing concrete to point to. And if I was wrong, if I was just being the jealous younger sister looking to tear down her successful brother, the fallout would destroy what was left of my relationship with my family. So, I did nothing. I watched, and I worried, and I hoped I was wrong. But I started being more careful about what information I left out at work, and I stopped mentioning details about my job during family conversations. It wasn't enough, and it was too late. But I tried. The monthly family dinner in mid-December was supposed to be a celebration. Ethan had closed what he described as the biggest deal of my career with a client from New York, and he'd received a bonus that he claimed would set me up for life. My parents were glowing with pride. My mother had spent days preparing his favorite foods, and the dining room was decorated with congratulations banners that made the house look like a campaign headquarters. I arrived with a bottle of wine I couldn't afford and a knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter all week. "Lena!" my mother exclaimed when I walked through the front door, giving me the kind of enthusiastic hug she usually reserved for Ethan's arrivals. "I'm so glad you could make it. Wait until you hear about your brother's success." My father was equally animated, clapping me on the shoulder and leading me into the living room where Ethan was holding court, drink in hand, regaling someone on speakerphone with the details of his latest triumph. "I've got to go," he said into the phone, grinning at our parents. "Family dinner. Time to celebrate with the people who always believed in me." The job was subtle but unmistakable. The people who always believed in me. Not just the people who believed in me, but the people who always had. The implication being that some people, namely me, had not. "Congratulations," I said, forcing a smile as I handed him the wine. "Mom says you landed a big client." "The biggest," he said, accepting the bottle without looking at the label. "This New York firm has been looking to expand into Pennsylvania healthcare investments, and they chose Morrison Associates to manage their portfolio. We're talking millions of dollars, Lena. Millions." Healthcare investments. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. "That's wonderful," I managed. "How did you know they were interested in healthcare?"
Ethan's smile widened, and there was something predatory about it. You develop instincts in this business. You learn to read the market, spot trends before they become obvious to everyone else. It's all about having the right information at the right time. My father nodded approvingly. That's what separates the successful people from the rest. Intelligence, instinct, and timing. "Exactly," Ethan said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "Some people spend their whole lives reacting to what's already happened. But successful people, we make things happen." The dinner conversation continued in this vein for the next hour. Ethan describing his brilliant strategies, his keen insights, his ability to predict market trends. My parents hanging on every word, asking questions that allowed him to elaborate further on his own genius. And me, sitting there with my growing suspicions and my complete inability to do anything about them. By the time my mother served dessert, Ethan was on his third glass of wine, and his stories were becoming more detailed, more boastful, more revealing. He talked about client meetings where he'd impressed executives with his knowledge of local business developments. He mentioned casual conversations at country club events where he'd picked up useful intelligence about upcoming projects and policy changes. "The key," he said, gesturing with his dessert fork, "is building relationships with people who have access to information. You'd be amazed what people will tell you at parties, or over lunch, or just in casual conversation. Sometimes they don't even realize they're sharing valuable intelligence." I thought about all the times I'd told my family about my work at the medical center. All the board meetings I'd mentioned, the projects I'd discussed, the confidential information I'd shared because I trusted them. And because I wanted to feel included in family conversations. "That sounds almost like insider trading," I said quietly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. The room went silent, and everyone turned to look at me. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Insider trading is when you use material, non-public information to trade securities illegally. What I do is market research and relationship building. It's completely different. Of course it is, my mother said quickly, shooting me a warning look. Ethan would never do anything unethical. Never, my father agreed. Your brother has always conducted himself with the highest integrity. I should have dropped it. Should have apologized for the implication and moved on to safer topics. But the wine had loosened my tongue, and months of watching Ethan's increasingly suspicious success had worn down my usual caution. I'm just saying, I continued, the line between market research and insider trading can be pretty thin sometimes. Not if you know what you're doing, Ethan said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Of course, that requires understanding complex financial regulations and having actual experience in the industry. Not everyone can grasp those kinds of nuances. The dismissal was clear, and the message was familiar. I was too stupid to understand his sophisticated world. But this time, instead of shrinking back, I felt something harden inside me. You're right. I don't understand complex financial regulations, but I do understand ethics. The silence that followed my comment was deafening. My father set down his wine glass with a sharp clink. My mother's face went pale, and Ethan's mask of casual superiority finally slipped. Ethics, he said, leaning forward in his chair. You want to talk about ethics? Let's talk about ethics. I should have backed down then. Should have apologized, laughed it off, changed the subject to something safe. But something in his tone, something in the way he was looking at me like an insect that had dared to crawl onto his dinner plate, made me hold my ground. I was just making an observation, I said. No, you weren't. You were making an accusation. You were implying that I'm some kind of criminal because you can't handle the fact that I'm successful and you're not. Ethan, my mother said nervously, maybe we should... No, Mom. I'm tired of tiptoeing around Lena's feelings. I'm tired of pretending that her bitterness and jealousy aren't obvious to everyone in this room. He turned back to me, his eyes cold and hard. You want to talk about ethics? What's ethical about coming to a celebration dinner for your brother and spending the whole evening trying to tear him down? I'm not trying to tear you down, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. Aren't you? Then what was that comment about insider trading? What was all that passive-aggressive bullshit about not understanding how I can afford my lifestyle? He was standing now, towering over me, his face flushed with wine and anger.
All night with that sour expression, like someone forced you to come here, like celebrating your brother's success is some kind of torture for you? That's not. It is exactly that, he interrupted. And you know what? I get it. I really do. It must be hard being the failure in a family of successful people. It must be frustrating watching your older brother achieve everything you dreamed of while you're stuck processing insurance forms and writing little articles that nobody wants to read. Each word hit like a physical blow. I felt my cheeks burning, my hands shaking in my lap. Ethan, please, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Please what, Dad? Please pretend that Lena hasn't been passively, aggressively undermining me since the day she moved back to town? Please ignore the fact that she can't be happy for anyone else's success because she's so miserable about her own life? Stop, I whispered. Stop what? Stop telling the truth? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The truth is that you're 26 years old and you're living in a studio apartment, working a dead-end job and writing freelance articles for grocery store newsletters. The truth is that you moved back home because you couldn't make it in the real world. The truth is that you're jealous of everything I have because deep down, you know you'll never achieve anything close to what I've accomplished. Ethan, that's enough, my mother said, but she didn't stand up. She didn't move to defend me. She just sat there, looking uncomfortable. Is it enough, Mom? Is it enough when she comes to my celebration dinner and accuses me of being a criminal? Is it enough when she can't even pretend to be happy for her own brother? He turned back to me, leaning down so his face was close to mine. You know what's really pathetic, Lena? It's not that you failed. It's that you're so bitter about failing that you can't stand to see anyone else succeed. Pathetic. There it was. The word I'd been waiting for my whole life. The word that summarized everything my family really thought about me. I stood up so abruptly that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. My legs felt unsteady, but I managed to stay upright. You're right, I said quietly. I am pathetic. Pathetic for thinking this family might someday see me as something more than a disappointment. Pathetic for believing that my own brother might show me even basic respect. Pathetic for hoping that one day you might stop being such a cruel, arrogant asshole long enough to remember that I'm a human being with feelings. The room went completely silent. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, could hear the heating system cycling on, could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. How dare you speak to your brother that way? My father said finally, his voice cold and authoritative. How dare I? I laughed, and it sounded hysterical even to me. How dare he speak to me that way? How dare any of you sit here and let him tear me apart like that? Lena, honey, my mother said, reaching toward me. You're upset. Maybe you should. Maybe I should what? Apologize? Pretend this didn't happen? Go back to being the grateful little failure who's just happy to be included in family dinners? I looked around the table at the three people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My father was glaring at me like I'd committed treason. My mother was wringing her hands and avoiding eye contact. And Ethan was smiling, actually smiling, like he'd enjoyed every second of destroying me. You know what? You're all pathetic. Pathetic for enabling him, pathetic for excusing his cruelty, and pathetic for caring more about appearances than about treating each other with basic human decency. I walked toward the front door, my legs somehow carrying me, even though I felt like I might collapse at any moment. Lena, wait, my mother called after me. I turned back one last time. Don't call me unless you're ready to apologize. All of you. I slammed the door behind me and somehow made it to my car before the tears started. I drove home through blurry vision and shaking hands, somehow managing not to crash into anything despite the fact that I could barely see the road through my tears. By the time I reached my apartment, the crying had turned into ugly, gasping sobs that left me feeling hollow and exhausted. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to pull myself together enough to walk upstairs without having a complete breakdown in front of my neighbors. When I finally made it inside, I collapsed on my couch and cried until I had no tears left. Then I got angry. Not the quiet, swallowed anger I'd carried for years, but a clean, burning fury that felt like fire in my chest. Angry at Ethan for being cruel. Angry at my parents for allowing it. Angry at myself for enduring it for so long. But most of all, angry that I'd been right about my suspicions and hadn't done anything about them. Because sitting there in my studio apartment at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, replaying Ethan's boasts about his insider knowledge and relationship building, I knew with absolute certainty that my brother was dirty. The way he talked about picking up useful intelligence at social events, about having information at the right time, about building relationships with people who had access to confidential data, it wasn't market research. It was exactly what it sounded like. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I could call the medical center's compliance office and report my suspicions, but what would I tell them? That my brother worked for a firm that had won a contract they'd offered? That he seemed to know things he shouldn't know? That he'd made comments at a family dinner that sounded suspicious? I could call the SEC the whistleblower hotline, but again, I had no concrete evidence, just suspicions and coincidences and a gut feeling that something was wrong. Or I could do what I'd been trained to do as a journalist
investigate. I spent the next 3 hours at my laptop researching Morrison Associates' recent contracts and client acquisitions. It didn't take long to find a pattern. Over the past year, they'd won bids for financial services contracts with 3 different healthcare organizations in the region, all organizations that had announced major expansion or acquisition plans shortly after Morrison Associates had been hired. All organizations where someone might have had access to confidential planning documents before they were made public. I cross-referenced the dates of the contract awards with my own work calendar and felt sick to my stomach. The medical center's cardiology wing expansion, the merger discussions with smaller practices, the insurance company negotiations, all topics that had come up during family dinners in the weeks before Morrison Associates had somehow positioned themselves perfectly to benefit from the outcomes. It still wasn't proof, but it was enough to convince me that I wasn't imagining things. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan calling me pathetic, so my parents sitting there doing nothing while he tore me apart. I thought about all the years of dismissal and discouragement, all the times they'd chosen his reputation over my well-being. At 3 a.m., I made a decision. I opened my laptop and started typing an email to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I didn't have evidence, but I had observations and concerns and a detailed timeline of suspicious coincidences. I described Ethan's work at Morrison Associates, the contracts they'd won, the confidential information I had access to at the medical center, and the pattern of successful bids that seemed to correlate with non-public information. I wrote about the family dinner, about Ethan's comments regarding insider knowledge and relationship building. I included dates, names, and as many specific details as I could remember. When I finished, I read it over 3 times, added my contact information, and hit send before I could change my mind. Then I finally fell asleep on my couch, still wearing the dress I'd worn to what I now thought of as my last family dinner. I woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls from my mother. I didn't answer them. Instead, I called in sick to work, made a pot of coffee, and tried to figure out what I'd just set in motion. It would be weeks before I got an answer to that question. But later, when FBI agent Rebecca Torres showed up at my apartment with a badge and a list of questions, I would learn that my email hadn't been the first complaint they'd received about Morrison Associates. It had just been the most detailed, and the one that finally gave them probable cause for a warrant. 3 weeks passed before Agent Rebecca Torres knocked on my apartment door on a cold Thursday morning in January. 3 weeks during which my mother called me daily, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that I didn't return. 3 weeks during which my father showed up at my workplace twice, demanding that I come home for dinner so we could talk through this family disagreement like adults. 3 weeks during which Ethan himself texted me exactly once, "Hope you're proud of yourself." I wasn't proud, exactly. I was terrified. When Agent Torres introduced herself and showed me her FBI credentials, my first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home. But she'd already seen me through the window, and running wasn't really an option anyway. "Miss Carter," she said, settling into the only comfortable chair in my studio apartment while I perched nervously on the edge of my bed. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me."
Agent Torres was not what I'd expected. She was younger than I'd imagined an FBI agent would be, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and sharp brown eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my cramped living space. She wore a simple black suit and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that suggested she was used to people taking her seriously. "I want to start by saying that the information you provided in your email was very helpful," she continued, pulling out a small notebook and pen. "But I need to ask you some follow-up questions to clarify a few details." "Am I in trouble?" I asked, the words coming out smaller than I'd intended. Agent Torres studied me for a moment. "Miss Carter, you've potentially helped us identify a serious financial crime. You're not in trouble. But I do need you to understand that what we discuss here today is part of an ongoing federal investigation, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Over the next 2 hours, Agent Torres walked me through everything I'd written in my email, and then some. She asked about specific dates, specific conversations, specific details about my work at the medical center and the information I might have inadvertently shared with my family. She wanted to know about Ethan's lifestyle, his spending habits, his comments about clients and deals. You mentioned in your email that your brother talked about building relationships with people who have access to information, she said, consulting her notes. Can you be more specific about what he said? I recounted the dinner conversation as accurately as I could, including Ethan's comments about picking up useful intelligence at social events and his boasts about having information at the right time. Agent Torres nodded, making notes, and you said he specifically mentioned healthcare investments in relation to his most recent client. Yes. He said the New York firm was interested in Pennsylvania healthcare investments, and that's why they chose Morrison Associates. But he seemed to know details about local healthcare developments that hadn't been made public yet. Such as? I told her about the medical center's expansion plans, the merger discussions, the insurance negotiations, all information that had been discussed in confidential board meetings that I'd helped schedule and coordinate. Miss Carter, Agent Torres said, closing her notebook, I need to ask you directly, did you ever intentionally share confidential information from your workplace with your brother? The question hit me like a punch to the stomach. No, never intentionally, but I talked about my work at family dinners. General stuff, you know? I'd mentioned that we were having a lot of board meetings or that there were big projects being planned. I never thought. I trailed off, feeling sick. You never thought he would use that information illegally, Agent Torres finished. Miss Carter, what you described sounds like casual family conversation, not intentional disclosure of material non-public information. You're not responsible for how your brother may have chosen to use or interpret what you shared. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by a new fear. What happens now? I asked. Agent Torres stood up, tucking her notebook into her jacket pocket. Now we continue our investigation. I may need to speak with you again as we gather more evidence, and there's a possibility you could be called to testify if this case goes to trial. Will my family know that I contacted you? She looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. Miss Carter, investigations like this one tend to become public eventually. I can't guarantee that your role will remain confidential indefinitely. After she left, I sat in my apartment for a long time, staring at the business card she had given me and wondering what I'd set in motion. Part of me wanted to call her back and take it all back somehow, to pretend the conversation had never happened and go back to the familiar misery of my old life. But a bigger part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since that dinner from hell, felt something I hadn't felt in years. Vindicated. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't jealous or bitter or looking for reasons to tear Ethan down. I was right. That evening, Michael called to invite me to dinner, and for the first time in weeks, I said yes. My parents showed up at my apartment unannounced on Saturday morning, 6 days after Agent Torres's visit. I was still in my pajamas, drinking coffee, and trying to work on a freelance article about local business trends, an assignment that now felt uncomfortably relevant to my situation. Lena, we need to talk, my father said the moment I opened the door. He looked older than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes and a gray cast to his usually ready complexion.
My mother stood behind him, clutching her purse like a shield. She'd been crying recently. Her eyes were red and puffy despite the carefully applied makeup. I suppose you'd better come in, I said, stepping aside to let them into my small space. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, my parents clearly uncomfortable in surroundings that showcased exactly how far their younger daughter had fallen from the family's standards of success. The FBI came to see us yesterday, my father said without preamble. They had a lot of questions about Ethan and his work. I sat down on my bed, leaving them the couch and the single chair. I see. They also had questions about you,
my mother added, her voice barely above a whisper. About your job at the medical center and what you might have told us about their business. I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. Lena, my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood when he expected immediate compliance. This situation has gotten completely out of hand. Whatever you think you know about your brother's work, you're wrong. Ethan is a successful, ethical businessman who has worked hard for everything he's achieved. The FBI doesn't seem to think so, I said quietly. The FBI is fishing. They're looking for someone to blame for their own inability to understand how legitimate financial services work. And unfortunately, they found someone willing to feed them false information. The accusations stung, but I held my ground. I didn't give them false information, Dad. I told them what I observed and what I heard. You told them lies and speculation designed to destroy your own brother's reputation, he said, his face flushing red with anger. Do you have any idea what this could do to him? To our family? To the business I've spent 30 years building? Thomas, my mother said, softly, putting her hand on his arm. Honey, I know you and Ethan had a disagreement at dinner. I know he said some things that hurt your feelings. But this isn't the way to handle family problems. This is destructive. Destructive? I stood up, feeling the familiar surge of anger that had been my constant companion for the past month. Mom, he called me pathetic. He tore me apart in front of you and Dad, and neither of you said a word to defend me. And now you're here asking me to protect him? He's your brother, she said, as if that explained everything. He's also potentially a criminal. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. My father's face went white, and my mother actually gasped. How dare you, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet. How dare you say that about your own brother? I dare because it's the truth. Or at least it's what the evidence suggests. I crossed my arms, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Dad, where do you think Ethan's money is coming from? How do you think he can afford a Mercedes and a luxury apartment and trips to Miami on a senior analyst salary? He's successful. He's too successful. And his success seems to correlate perfectly with non-public information that he shouldn't have access to. My mother was crying now, not the delicate tears of a woman trying to maintain her composure, but ugly, desperate sobs. Please, Lena, please don't do this to our family. I didn't do anything to our family, Mom. Ethan did. And you and Dad enabled him by refusing to hold him accountable for anything, ever. That's not true, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? When has Ethan ever faced consequences for his behavior? When have you ever told him that treating me like garbage wasn't acceptable? When have you ever chosen my well-being over his reputation? Silence. I thought so. My father straightened up, and I could see him shifting from parental pleading to business negotiation mode. What do you want, Lena? Excuse me? What do you want? Money? A better job? Help with your student loans? What will it take for you to call the FBI and tell them you made a mistake? I stared at him, feeling something cold and final settle in my chest. You think I did this for money?
I think you did this because you're angry and jealous and you want to hurt Ethan. So what will it take to make you stop? I looked at my parents, really looked at them. My father, red-faced and desperate, trying to buy his golden child's way out of trouble. My mother, sobbing and begging me to sacrifice my integrity for the sake of family appearances. These people had never really seen me. They'd never valued me for who I was, only criticized me for who I wasn't. They'd spent my entire life making it clear that Ethan's comfort and success mattered more than my feelings or well-being. There's nothing you can offer me that would make me lie to federal agents, I said. Nothing. Then you're making a terrible mistake, my father said, standing up. "And when this destroys Ethan's career and ruins our family's reputation, I hope you'll be satisfied with what you've accomplished." If telling the truth destroys Ethan's career, then his career deserved to be destroyed. They left without another word, my mother still crying and my father practically vibrating with rage. I watched them drive away from my window, and for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt something approaching peace. I called Michael and asked if he wanted to get lunch. For once, I had an appetite. 2 weeks later, Agent Torres called to ask if I could come to the FBI field office in Philadelphia for a follow-up interview. The 45-minute drive gave me plenty of time to work myself into a state of anxiety that had me gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The federal building was exactly as intimidating as I'd expected, all concrete and glass and security checkpoints that made me feel like I was doing something wrong just by being there. Agent Torres met me in the lobby and escorted me through a maze of corridors to a small conference room with fluorescent lights and no windows. "Thank you for coming in, Miss Carter," she said, gesturing for me to sit at a table that looked like it had seen better decades. "I have some information to share with you, and I need to ask a few more questions." She opened a file folder and pulled out several documents. "We've been investigating Morrison Associates for the past 6 months, following complaints from other sources about their unusually successful bidding record with healthcare organizations." Other sources? Employees at 2 other medical facilities in the region noticed similar patterns to what you described. Confidential information somehow making its way to Morrison and Associates before contract bids were submitted. She slid a document across the table. "This is a timeline we've constructed of their contract wins over the past year." I studied the timeline, feeling my stomach drop as I recognized several of the organizations listed. These are all places that had major developments or policy changes shortly after Morrison and Associates was hired. Exactly. And in each case, we've found evidence that someone with access to confidential planning documents had contact with your brother in the weeks before the contracts were awarded. Agent Torres pulled out another document. "We've also been analyzing your brother's financial records. His lifestyle has been funded by a series of cash deposits that don't correspond to his salary or any legitimate investment returns." Cash deposits? Cash that's very difficult to trace, which is exactly how someone would want to structure payments for illegal information. She leaned forward. "Miss Carter, your brother has been running a sophisticated insider trading operation. He cultivates relationships with people who have access to non-public information, pays them for that information, and then uses it to position Morrison and Associates for lucrative contracts." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Even though I'd suspected something like this, hearing it laid out in such stark terms was overwhelming. "How many people?" I asked. "We've identified at least 8 individuals who appear to have provided information to your brother in exchange for payment. Administrative assistants, board members, even a few executives who were struggling with personal financial problems." "And me?" Agent Torres shook her head. "You weren't paid, and based on our investigation, we don't believe you knowingly provided information for illegal purposes. Your brother exploited family conversations and your trust. That's not the same thing as participating in his scheme." The relief was immediate and overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much I'd been worrying about my own culpability until she explicitly cleared me. "What happens now?" I asked. "We're building a case. We have financial records, recorded phone calls, email communications, and testimony from several cooperating witnesses. Your brother's going to be arrested probably within the next week or 2.
Arrested. My brother, the golden child, the success story, was going to be arrested by federal agents. "Miss Carter," Agent Torres continued, "I need to warn you that this is going to become public very quickly once we make the arrest. Your family is likely to face significant media attention, and there may be pressure from your community and from your brother's legal team." "What kind of pressure?" "The kind designed to make witnesses reconsider their testimony. The kind that suggests you're a disgruntled family member looking for revenge rather than someone who came forward with legitimate concerns." She met my eyes directly. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my parents' visit, about their attempts to buy my silence, about a lifetime of being told that Ethan's reputation mattered more than the truth. "Agent Torres," I said, "I've been dealing with pressure from my family my entire life. At least now I know I'm on the right side." She smiled for the first time since I'd met her. "Good, because we're going to need you to testify when this goes to trial." The drive home felt different somehow. The same highway, the same exit ramp, the same parking lot at my apartment complex. But I wasn't the same person who had driven to Philadelphia that morning. For 26 years, I'd believed my family's version of reality. I was the disappointment, the failure, the one who couldn't measure up to Ethan's success. I was too sensitive, too jealous, too bitter to see my brother's accomplishments for what they really were. But it turned out their version of reality was a lie. Ethan wasn't successful. He was a criminal. His achievements weren't the result of hard work and brilliance. They were the product of fraud and betrayal. And my instincts, the ones my family had taught me not to trust, had been right all along. That night, I called Michael and told him everything I could share without violating the FBI's guidelines about the ongoing investigation. "How are you feeling?" he asked when I finished. I thought about it for a moment. "Free," I said finally. "For the first time in my life, I feel free." 3 days later, Ethan was arrested at his office in front of his colleagues and clients. The local news ran the story that evening, complete with footage of him being led away in handcuffs. My phone started ringing immediately, but for the first time in my life, I didn't answer when my parents called. I had nothing left to say to them. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Philadelphia, watching my brother being led away in handcuffs for the second time. This time it wasn't just an arrest, it was a sentencing. 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, plus restitution of nearly $2 million to the victims of his insider trading scheme. The judge had been particularly harsh in her remarks about Ethan's, quote, betrayal of trust and exploitation of personal relationships for financial gain. She'd called his crimes a calculated pattern of deception that damaged not only financial markets, but the lives of individuals who trusted him. My parents sat 3 rows behind me, looking like they'd aged a decade in the past 6 months. They hadn't spoken to me since Ethan's arrest, except through lawyers when the prosecution needed to clarify details about my testimony. Even now, they couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge my presence in the courtroom. I didn't care anymore. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. For weeks after Ethan's arrest, I'd been consumed by a toxic mixture of guilt, vindication, and grief. Guilt because part of me felt responsible for destroying my family. Vindication because I'd been proven right about everything I'd suspected. Grief because I was finally mourning the family I'd always wanted, but never actually had. Michael had been patient through all of it, listening when I needed to talk and giving me space when I needed to process. You didn't destroy your family. Your family destroyed itself. You just refused to help them cover it up. The media attention had been intense but brief. "Local Golden Boy exposed as financial fraudster" was the headline in the Millbrook Observer, accompanied by a photo of him in handcuffs and a detailed account of his crimes. For a few weeks, everyone in town had an opinion about the Carter family scandal. But then a city council corruption case broke in the next county over, and we became yesterday's news.
The local news. Lena was always jealous of Ethan, and when she saw an opportunity to hurt him, she took it. The comments hurt, but they also clarified something important for me. My parents weren't capable of seeing the truth about Ethan, because admitting his guilt would mean acknowledging their own failures as parents. It would mean recognizing that they'd helped enable a criminal, excused his cruelty, and prioritized appearances over integrity for decades. They couldn't handle that level of self-examination, so they chose to make me the villain instead. But here's what I learned during those 6 months of ostracism and public scrutiny. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need them to see me as valuable or successful or worthy of love. Their opinion of me had never been based on who I actually was. It had been based on how I compared to their idealized version of Ethan. And that version of Ethan had been a lie. The real revelation came 3 months after Ethan's sentencing, when Agent Torres called to tell me that several other family members of Ethan's victims had reached out to thank me for coming forward. There was a woman whose retirement savings were wiped out when her company's stock tanked after Ethan's manipulation, Agent Torres told me.
She wanted you to know that your testimony helped her get some of her money back through the restitution order. I wasn't a vengeful sister destroying her successful brother out of jealousy. I was a whistleblower who'd helped protect other people from being victimized by a criminal who happened to be related to me. The distinction mattered. A week after Ethan began serving his sentence, I got a call from the editor of Philadelphia magazine. She'd followed the case and was interested in commissioning a first-person piece about the experience of exposing a family member's white-collar crime. "We're looking for something honest and nuanced," she explained. "Not a hit piece on your brother, but a thoughtful examination of family loyalty, truth-telling, and what happens when those values conflict." I wrote the piece over the course of 2 weeks, working on it every evening after my shifts at the medical center. It was the most honest thing I'd ever written, and the most difficult. But when it was published 2 months later, the response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from people who'd faced similar situations, family members who discovered relatives were involved in fraud, embezzlement, or other crimes, and who'd struggled with the decision of whether to come forward. "You gave me the courage to report my brother-in-law's tax evasion scheme," one woman wrote. "I'd been agonizing over it for months, but your article helped me realize that protecting someone from the consequences of their own actions isn't actually protection, it's enabling." The piece led to other writing opportunities. A national magazine asked me to investigate and write about financial crimes in small-town America. A nonprofit organization hired me to write their annual report about whistleblower protections. Slowly, carefully, I began rebuilding the journalism career I'd abandoned when I moved back to Millbrook. Last month, I gave notice at the medical center and accepted a position as a staff writer for an investigative journalism nonprofit in Philadelphia. My new job focuses on financial crimes and corporate accountability, areas where my experience with Ethan's case gives me unique insights and credibility. I'm moving back to Philadelphia next week, to a one-bedroom apartment with actual separate rooms and windows that faced east so I can watch the sunrise while I write. My parents haven't called to congratulate me on the new job. They haven't called at all, actually, since the sentencing. I used to think their silence was punishment, but now I understand it's a gift. They've finally given me what I always needed but never knew how to ask for: freedom from their expectations, their disappointments, and their toxic version of family loyalty. I'm 27 years old, and I'm just now learning who I am when I'm not defined by my failure to be Ethan Carter's successful sister. Turns out, I'm pretty remarkable on my own. The pathetic sister became the truth teller, the golden child became the criminal, and I became someone I can finally be proud of. Not bad for a family disappointment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.